Imagine waking up in a country where you despise the government. You feel trapped, powerless. And yet, every morning, you put on your uniform and obediently go to work. History is littered with incredibly oppressive systems that manage to survive for decades without anyone resisting. Why? Humans possess a deep-seated instinct for self-preservation. Even when a system is terrible, the predictable misery of the status quo often feels safer than the sheer terror of chaotic uncertainty. This diagram illustrates system justification. It shows the unconscious psychological bias that drives people to rationalize their current environment, suppressing the urge to rebel just to maintain a baseline sense of safety. Fear makes this anchor even heavier. The persistent threat of prison or losing a job isolates individuals, tricking every single citizen into secretly believing they are the only one who hates the regime. Dictatorships rarely survive on military force alone. They endure because this isolated fear makes the current reality feel completely inevitable. There is a persistent myth that people rebel simply because they become poor. History, however, repeatedly proves this theory otherwise. The real threat to an entrenched system comes from an entirely different psychological pressure: relative deprivation. You can see two diverging trends: a steadily climbing trajectory of what a population expects, contrasted against the sharply dropping reality of what they experience. As that gap widens, it traps an immense reservoir of frustration. You can have a society filled with millions of furious individuals, but as long as those people remain cut off from one another, that immense pressure stays locked away as passive resentment. To break that equilibrium, the trapped frustration requires a localized spark. Often, it's a surprisingly random event, a local protest or a single arrest. That spark triggers a distinct cognitive mechanism known as collective identity. The minor event gives millions of citizens a shared symbol. In an instant, it changes the internal monologue of the entire population. The isolated thought of "I am angry" vanishes. It is replaced by the sudden realization that we are angry. The spark itself does not cause the uprising. Its power lies entirely in acting as a signal flare that permanently shatters the illusion of suffering alone. Once that isolation breaks, a rapid emotional phase transition sweeps through the public. Paralyzing fear evaporates, replaced by a contagious sense of hope. This illustrates the final psychological ingredient: collective efficacy. You see isolated dots rapidly drawing connective lines and illuminating simultaneously as a unified cluster. It is the sudden, intoxicating belief that this group possesses the power to dismantle the system. This new belief fundamentally rewrites the entire math of society. For the very first time, the risk of taking to the streets is perceived as lower than the risk of remaining compliant. At this exact cognitive tipping point, ordinary citizens do not suddenly mutate into fearless heroes. They simply realize their collective action is the only logical path forward. When those frustrated millions finally flood the streets, their underlying nature hasn't changed. Their psychology has simply caught up with their numbers. There is a widespread misconception that a societal collapse begins the moment the first window is smashed or the first barricade is built. Physical unrest is a late-stage symptom of a process that has already finished. The actual revolution happened months, sometimes years earlier, quietly, inside the collective minds of the population. The next time you watch a regime fall, look past the marching armies and the shouting politicians. History is ultimately drafted by the invisible architecture of human psychology.